Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I am Shannon Rogers, your host, and it's episode 149. Today we're going to discuss Douglas Fir. It's a species that most of us know, but how much do we really know about it? It's a species that permeates construction lumber, fine furniture, fine home building. It's kind of everywhere you look. And I feel like it deserves kind of a closer look. So, as always, I'm here to answer your lumber questions. I'm here to delve into the lumber industry, and I'm here to hopefully provide a conduit for you to get your questions about the lumber industry answered. So, as always, send me questions. Send me an email, lumberupdate@gmail.com, or find me on Instagram at lumberupdateshow, or just go to lumberupdate.com and fill out the contact form and submit your questions there. And of course, big thanks to all those who support the show over at patreon.com/lumberupdate. It's also another way to get your questions answered. If you are a Patreon supporter, submit your questions there, and I can guarantee you they're going to bump right to the top of the list. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I got a few things. Certainly Douglas Fir is kind of our main topic, but I have some questions about bugs, bug prevention, but more importantly, working wood when you're doing bug prevention. We're going to talk about acacia. What's the deal with acacia? And then we're going to revisit the wood toxicity and talk a little bit about sensitizers. I got a question about that. But before that, I wanted to kind of jump into some news stories. There's some interesting stuff going on here. And basically, the theme of this is robots. So I found this video, and I had a couple of people send it to me, but it's basically the story of a company up in Canada that manufactures robots for the lumber industry. And as you can see, those watching the video on screen, there's a robot that's moving sheet goods. This kind of suction cup clamp idea is very common for moving sheet goods or even moving whole packs of bundled lumber. This is pretty common nowadays, but what this company is doing is adding a lot more really intelligence, robotic intelligence into the mix. This robot can be programmed to do any number of operations. It also can be programmed to do very specific kind of manufacturing specific operations. In the end, this is just one of the robots that this company creates. There are hundreds of different ones where you can come to this company and say, here's my manufacturing process, here's what I want to automate, and they will build robots that automate it. And one thing I find particularly interesting about this is you guys have heard me talk about the timber frame industry in the past and how it's kind of revolutionizing construction. Well, robots are kind of behind that. So I've got another, oh, by the way, I will link to this video in my show notes if you want to check out the whole thing. It's just a really interesting interview with this company that produces robots for the lumber industry. In fact, on screen right now is a machine that's a robot that's used to actually fill plywood voids, something we all love plywood voids. But anyway, there is a new mass timber building going up in Vancouver. It's a 9-story building, entirely mass timber. And if I scroll through this article, one of the first things you're going to notice is the mass timber plant that's producing the panels, they're using robots. And this is very common when you look at a lot of these mass timber facilities. They're laminating up these enormous panels. Think of, the mother of all plywood panels, but it could be 8 inches thick and 100 feet long and 200 feet wide. And a lot of times the parts are then manufactured out of that giant sheet of mass timber. The CNC comes along and cuts out everything they need. Or sometimes the entire floor is one piece and it's got joinery cut into it, the various supports and struts to go into the floor. So when you're standing in that mass timber building, your floor and your ceiling are one giant CLT piece. And the joinery for the vertical members, the support structure, goes into that floor. It's not a series of joists like you might be used to in a normal stick frame house that has sheathing and then flooring put on top of it. It is a solid LVL And then you may have, sound dampening and cushioning and flooring and stuff put on top of that. So robots are everywhere in the mass timber industry, and I think you're going to see this more and more. So certainly people talk about AI taking over the world. A lot of these robots are relying upon artificial intelligence algorithms to do their job, to detect things like defects, to cut joinery in and around defects. It's really pretty amazing what they're doing. So yeah, Skynet. That's the wood version of Terminator, Skynet. Skynet will eventually take over and we'll all be doomed, but hey, it's going to be kind of fun to watch it happen at the same time. This is interesting, kind of going on with some of my political conversations about infrastructure in the U.S. and opening national lands to logging. Weyerhaeuser has sold off one of our large British Columbia plants. Now, they've sold it to one of their largest customers, a Canadian-owned company, and they will be taking control of this plant. So it's not a shutdown or reduction in capacity, but Weyerhaeuser decided to invest more in the U.S. Weyerhaeuser is a U.S. company. They've sold this BC plant, BC mill, I should say, and they've gone and invested in more timberlands. And here's this. Remember my last episode when I talked about how the southeastern United States and the southern yellow pine could handle the overflow, the shortage that would come from possibly no Canadian framing lumber. Weyerhaeuser is buying 117,000 acres in North Carolina and Virginia. Yup, that's southern yellow pine land. So we talk about convincing builders, contractors to start using southern yellow pine instead of the northern hem-fir whitewoods. Well, here is a major manufacturer of construction lumber that is selling off property they own in Canada and buying timberlands and timber processing facilities in the southeastern United States. That could be particularly interesting to see how that develops. Weyerhaeuser is one of those giants in the industry. When they do things, people tend to follow along shortly after and, model their business by what Weyerhaeuser is doing. We'll see. Very interesting. Anyway, let's move to the featured species, Douglas Fir. This species is near and dear to my heart. I'm actually sitting at a workbench right now, built entirely out of Douglas Fir timbers. I used 6 by 8s for the legs. The top is laminated up with 6 by 6s. The feet are, what were those, 6 by 6s. I've got stretchers made of 2 by 8s and 4 by 6s. It's just a series of Douglas Fir timbers all thrown together. I built a number of pieces of furniture out of Douglas Fir. I have a frame saw hanging on my wall that's built out of fine comb, very fine clear Douglas Fir as well. It's found everywhere. Like I said in the introduction to this show, it is the F in SPF, structural lumber, spruce pine fir. It's the F in that. It's the fir in the hem-fir construction lumber that you find on the shelves of your big box stores. But like some of these woods, I talked about this hemlock when I featured it, it's starting to develop another life. It has that entire structural grade construction lumber, and we should be very clear about Douglas Fir. It is a very structural timber. It's one of the reasons that you find it in 2x4s and 2x6s. It's also one of the reasons that we find it in big ol' honkin' beams, or we find it showing up in timber framing. Douglas Fir is the timber framer's dream. They're using it constantly for timber frame all over the place. Well, why is this? Well, simply put, if we look at the structural numbers, it's got a hardness of 620 that can sometimes be reported around 700. So, it's of cherry hardness, a little softer than cherry, but it's certainly harder than a lot of the other white northern woods. But here's the thing. Modulus of rupture, 12,500. Modulus of elasticity, 1.765 million. So it is super, super stiff. It's one of the reasons that you see a lot of weekend woodworkers building their workbenches, their Roubo style workbenches, out of fir, because that stiffness allows it to span. And the Roubo workbench, if you don't know, been living under a rock for the last 20 years, It is a giant slab with just legs underneath it. No stretchers, no aprons or anything like that. And the stiffness of that, because you may have a 4 or 5 foot span between your legs, you need a lumber that is particularly stiff. And that's Douglas fir, which is why you see it being used in framing like this. Now, certainly one of the other things that's important is the tree itself. It is a big, tall tree. Measures up to 250 feet in height, diameters of 6+ feet around. It's a big tree. It also very quickly, well, at about 2 years, you'll find that it starts to drop its lower branches and the canopy moves further up. So the image that I'm showing on my screen is kind of the archetypical cylindrical model of a Douglas fir. And a Douglas fir is a softwood, is an evergreen tree, but think of your typical Christmas tree and chop like the bottom third of the Christmas tree off. So the really wide branches that make that kind of triangular Christmas tree look. Chop the wide branches off and you get more of this kind of pipe cleaner look, this more cylindrical look without that flaring out at the bottom. That's the standard morphology or silhouette of the Douglas fir tree. That also is what allows it to produce these giant timbers with relatively few defects. Now, I've got a big old piece of Douglas fir that I'll show on camera. This is 12 inches wide. It's 6/4, and it's got a big old knot right smack in the middle of it. It's got a series of, actually, no, it does not. I was going to say it has a series of pin knots. It does not. This is actually very clear Douglas fir. And Douglas fir can be had in clear. It can also be had in STK or select tight knot. Douglas fir is certainly going to have its share of knots, but because it's dropping those limbs and it's growing up and extending that trunk and moving the canopy further off the ground, you end up with this central bowl that has very few knots in it. You may have some pin knots from those earlier years, the early branches that fell off, but then you'll end up having, decades of growth on top of that that is essentially knot free. And that is where we're able to get large box heart beams, or even I've seen a lot of free of heart center beams. My work bench, my joinery bench I'm sitting at, was built with all appearance grade free of heart center. FOHC is what it's stamped on the end. Free of heart center, meaning if you're watching the video, the beam in the bottom center is a boxed heart beam where the pith, the heart of the tree, is right smack in the middle of the tree. Free of heart center means you've cut that, you place that timber somewhere off to the side away from the pith, and there's no pith, there's no heart at all in that that beam, 6x6, 4x6, whatever the beam is. And that means it's going to not quite check so much because it doesn't have the pith in it. It's still going to check because it's a big beam, but it's a little bit more of an appearance grade lumber. So fir is interesting. There's a lot of big softwoods in the Canadian forest. Hemlock's another one that we feature on the show. Hemlock can certainly have a heck of a lot more knots than Douglas fir, and Western Red Cedar for that matter. And here's what's also interesting is Douglas fir is on the comeback trail. Western Red Cedar gained a lot of prominence in exterior siding, cedar shakes, things like that. You could get a lot of clear vertical grain cedar. You also could find a use for the STK cedar at the same time. And people started growing, replanting, and harvesting Western Red Cedar like mad. And they kind of left the Douglas fir alone for the last 50 some years. It was always there. It was always being harvested. But the structural stuff, the studs, the 2x6s, 2x8s, etc., that was being grown on its own, I don't want to say plantation, but yeah, for that matter, a plantation. And it was being grown for structural lumber. And I've talked about this in several of my They Don't Make Studs Like They Used To episodes. There's our specific sections of land set aside for growing. Here's a 2x6 forest. Here's a 2x4 forest. Here's a 2x12 forest. That's where that Douglas fir is being grown. The forest stuff, the stuff that's not being replanted, the stuff that's being Mother Nature doing the replanting, non-plantation material, in other words, that was kind of stepped around or occasionally logged in order to embrace a more diversified silvicultural plan. What has happened is the Douglas fir tree is started to overtake the Western red in northern forests. The Douglas fir tree tends to be a little bit hardier, a little bit stronger, and it was crowding out, providing competition for the Western red cedar. And it got to the point where several concessions that were traditionally Western red cedar concessions were suddenly becoming Douglas fir concessions. And think of it like crop rotation, where you planted a particular crop and then you plant another crop the next year in order to diversify the soil content, the soil chemistry, to allow your crops to grow better year after year. That's kind of a terrible metaphor now that I think about it, because nobody is clear cutting and planting Douglas fir one time, clear cutting and planting Western red cedar. But to provide a diversified forest, you've got multiple species growing, and they were logging out the Western red cedar, allowing the Douglas fir to kind of get stronger. And while Western red was growing back up, the Douglas fir became the dominant species. Now there's this glut of Douglas fir all throughout the market. And what it's allowed us to do is certainly utilize more Douglas fir, but be a little bit pickier, because now there's a wider variety of grades that we never saw before. So Douglas fir can have life as, here is a bandsawn Douglas fir board. It's got, what is this? 8 inches wide, about 4 feet long. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 select tight knots in the board, and probably a handful of pin knots that you got to look pretty close to. This would be typical C and better grade for Douglas fir. It's still actually a pretty piece. It's also pretty sizable piece. If you flip to the other side, you can actually see a knot that's been removed. It looks like somebody drilled right through it. That's actually a very, very straight branch growing out of it. So you can get boards with that kind of frequency of knots. I would call it more of an STK board than a clear board. But then you also can get clear Douglas fir. So here's about an 18-inch by 8-inch wide piece of clear vertical grain fir. So it's essentially rift sawn. If I look at the end grain, I can see I've got growth rings at an angle to the face. And I've got, this is actually closer, I would call this quarter sawn based on the angle of those growth rings. But really, really clear. Now, you can see a bit of a knot down at the bottom. If I flip it over, you can see where that knot was. But this is completely clear otherwise, a much higher grade. Honestly, that's an appearance grade. I would still call it C and better because of that one knot. Here is an A and better vertical grain, clear vertical grain Douglas fir. I've got a little bit of mineral staining at the bottom, but there is not a single knot in this board. Again, 8 inches wide, about 18 inches long. It's just a small sample piece. But even that is not the top of the grade. If I look at this, clear vertical grain, maybe A grade piece, the growth rings, it's what I would expect to see in Douglas fir. I probably got 4 to 5 growth rings per inch. That would be second growth or third growth Douglas fir. But there's this other market for fine comb or old growth material. In any proper silvicultural plan, some of the older trees do need to be removed. And it does get to a point where those trees need to come down either due to age or in order to promote the growth of the forest around it. I am certainly not about going and logging old growth forests. All you're doing is seeking out old growth, but from time to time, it does need to come down. There's also a lot of instances where during fire prevention and thinning, some of those trees have come down. There's a whole forestry system based around that older growth fine combed timber. And this board is a good example of that. This is just a very small piece, but again, Douglas fir, sorry, my notation on the end there. And I actually notated Douglas fir DF on the end because this board is so fine, it reminds them a little bit of hemlock. I'll get to some of the differences in just a second. But if I look at the end grain here, it is, wow, can I even count this over an inch? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 growth rings per inch as compared to the 5 growth rings per inch, kind of the typical growth ring distribution you might find in a big box, 2 by whatever. This is incredibly fine grain, 100% clear, beautiful stuff. This is clear CVG fine comb, which can be a ridiculous price point. You can find some of this stuff running $22, $25 a linear foot as compared to, the second growth, third growth Douglas Fir, even clear vertical grain running $8 to $9 a linear foot. And that's kind of a broad range just based upon the knot that might show up in it. Even air quotes clear is not always clear. There can be a knot here and there, and you can find those prices dropping down to like $5 a linear foot sometimes. So it's a wide range, but all of those boards that I've been showing are not, while it is a structural tree, they're not meant for structural purposes. They're meant for aesthetic purposes. They have appearance grades put on them, not structural grades. So it's this totally other market, like we talked about with hemlock, that is now open for Douglas Fir. It wasn't really an opportunity before because nobody was logging Douglas Fir in those kind of quantities, and it's allowed this rebirth of the forest. Well, what I also find particularly interesting is we're utilizing the silvicultural plans are utilizing, current knowledge, 21st century silvicultural knowledge in order to protect these ecosystems and to further that. And what they're finding now is the forests are becoming even healthier because it was so heavily Western Red Cedar before. Here's the crazy part. The Western Red Cedar that was super heavy that was being logged, that was not first growth. That was second, sometimes third growth Western Red Cedar. Cedar obviously grows a little bit faster than Douglas Fir, but now we're running into second and third growth Douglas Fir and first growth Douglas Fir that's being interspersed, and we're finding this diversity in that forestry between Western Red Cedar, some white cedar, Douglas Fir, and hemlock, making more biodiversity in the forest, and with greater markets for Douglas Fir, hemlock, Western Red, Atlantic White. We're seeing that demand spread out across a number of these trees. So it's why I really wanted to highlight the Douglas Fir. Now, I've got a piece of hemlock, but it's the other side of the shop. And this is an audio podcast. I don't want to do too many visual aids here, but the difference between hemlock and Douglas Fir, I do find that hemlock, there's a little bit finer. There's more availability of finer grain because of the way the tree grows in some of the areas that it grows. But you'll find that Douglas Fir has just an overall pinkish hue to it, whereas hemlock is just kind of a white wood, maybe whitish gray wood. And that is the early to late wood transition. And Douglas Fir is not only stark contrast, but quite abrupt. And this is a great way to differentiate a lot of softwoods. So my early wood is the lighter kind of white wood. My late wood is the darker brown pinkish wood. And because there's such an abrupt transition, that's what gives you this really striped look to Douglas Fir. Hemlock will have that, but you'll find that the contrast between early and late is not nearly as much as Douglas Fir, and the transition is a little bit more gradual. It kind of goes from white to a little bit darker to a little bit darker to a little bit darker to kind of gray, whereas I can go from completely white to dark pink right away. It turns on a dime. Now that is also what attributes to some of its structural strength, is what also can kind of make it a pain in the butt to work. You got to have sharp tools to work this stuff, because as you're working across it, as you're planing across it or chiseling across it or sawing across it, you can get that board to stutter or your tool to stutter because it's going from softer wood to really, really hard wood to softer wood to really, really hard wood, like a washboard road. If you were to do Janka hardness tests on just the early wood and just the late wood, that'll be a little hard to do because the Janka test by definition is a 1/2 inch steel ball. You'd have to find a really, really wide growth ring to pull that off. But I've had some people who've tried to test that and made some estimations on it. The late wood is anywhere from 2 to 3 times harder than the early wood. So that darker kind of what gives the whole wood that pinkish hue is substantially harder. And that's really one of the best ways I found to differentiate Douglas Fir, or if you're going and looking at spruce pine fir, the spruce will be just white with not as much contrast. The hem fir will be kind of a whitish gray and then big old pink board. In fact, I remember Matt Bickford, the molding plane maker, had a blog called Musings from Big Pink, because that's what he called his Douglas Fir workbench, the Big Pink. So yeah, it's really kind of easy to differentiate. Once you see that kind of pink hue, you can't unsee it for that matter. From a stability perspective, it's got a TR ratio of 1.6. 7.5% tangential, 4.5% radial. Very typical of a lot of those Canadian whitewoods. Being a softwood, the structure is going to be tracheids rather than pores. The tracheids are fine. You're definitely going to need some sort of magnification to really see them. You will find a resin canal or two. Very rare, but that's another way to differentiate Douglas fir from some other softwoods like the spruce and the fir. This will have a resin canal or two, which a resin canal is kind of looks like a pore in softwood, but it's not a pore. It's a resin canal. And definitely that high contrast between early and late wood. Very, very distinctly Douglas fir. So what are we using it for? Well, most common is a construction lumber. As like I said, it's the F and SPF for spruce pine fir. Timber framing, definitely a big timber framer. And then this new CVG market for cladding and soffits and flooring, interior paneling. I'm seeing it showing up in furniture. I've actually seen clear vertical grain Douglas fir plywood now. It is definitely giving Western Red Cedar a run for its money. Now, there are some folks who are trying to thermally modify it. I kind of shrug and go, why would you do that? Douglas fir is an exterior grade wood. I have a bungee lathe in my backyard that I built 10 years ago, maybe 9 years ago. Has no finish on it whatsoever. It was made out of Douglas fir 4x4s and it's still as strong. And, the wood is as hard as it was the day I built it. So thermally modifying it doesn't really make a lot of sense because you already have an exterior grade lumber that you're making more exterior grade. Doesn't really make that much sense, honestly. But some people are trying it. We'll see that early to late wood transition being so abrupt, it causes moisture transfer problems, which can end up causing some delamination problems when you try to thermally modify it. We'll see what happens there. And then, of course, boat building. We see Douglas fir show up in ribs and even planking for boat building for, well, millennia, frankly. It is just a cool tree that you can find so many uses for it. It's, in many ways, it is very much ubiquitous with structural material, but I also love that it has this whole kind of fine woodworking feel. Some of the Douglas fir boards that I have in my shop, I've got a few on the top of my lumber rack that are beautiful, fine grain, completely clear boards. And there's no way I'm going to use those as secondary boards for like drawer parts or something like that. That's going to turn into a tabletop or a cabinet. It's designed to be shown off. And I just love that wood can be, construction, but then also really, really kind of high style, contemporary furniture, especially when you've got it in a CVG cut. It's got that much more contemporary feel to the whole thing. If you're looking for some alternative species, first thing I'd say is why, because Douglas fir is available pretty much everywhere. Western larch is one that you might look at, similar in appearance, a little bit harder than Douglas fir. Definitely doesn't have that. It's got a more homogeneous grain than Douglas fir. It doesn't have that kind of structural nature to it, but if you're building furniture, that's not really going to matter. Not so much in color, but redwood is an interesting alternative from an early to late wood. Certainly redwood's going to have a much redder cast to it, but as far as sizes, timbers and beams and things that are available, you'll find a lot of similarities between redwood and Douglas fir. Redwood's certainly softer, but still. Southern yellow pine, the ponderosa pine is a big tree that grows up real high, gets its branches away from the fire. So you end up with these long, straight sections. It's not as big a tree around a lot of times. So you can't necessarily get the large beams. It also tends to have a few more knots to it than Douglas fir, but you'll find some similarities, whereas Douglas fir has kind of an overall pinkish hue, ponderosa, lodgepole, they're going to have kind of a yellowish hue. That's why they're in the yellow pine group. And then, of course, hemlock that I've talked about a couple times already this episode. And, if you're interested, you can go back and look at the episode specifically featuring hemlock for more information on that. So, yeah, that's Douglas fir. Big fan of the tree, big fan of working with it, big fan of using it for a lot of different applications. So, if you want to be a fan of Douglas Fir and you want to get this Douglas Fir sticker, all the folks who become Patreon supporters in the month of May are going to get this sticker mailed out to him. If you're already a Patreon supporter, that sticker is probably already on its way to you right now. So thanks for supporting the show, folks. Patreon.com/lumberupdate. There's my little plug. Had to be done. Anyway, let's go answer some questions here. Oh, you know what? I did want to say one thing. For those that get the Douglas Fir sticker, there's a mistake on that sticker. That's all I'm going to say. But if you find the mistake, let's just put it this way. The first person to find the mistake, first person who emails me, lumberupdate@gmail.com, you're going to get a free Lumber Update t-shirt because there is a mistake on there. I build those stickers off of a template and sometimes I forget to change things. So there is a mistake that represents a previous month that I forgot to change. So if you find it, I may have just given it away. If you find it, let me know. You get a free t-shirt. Okay, moving on. I had a question from Garrett on Borate and tools. He said, let's see, can iron woodworking tools, planes, chisels, and such be used with wood previously soaked in Timbor? That's just a brand name. It's a water-soluble borate powder used to prevent boring insects and stuff. Borax, borate, Timbor, they're all borates, which I think is more of a chemical group than anything else. Boron silicas, maybe? Boron oxygens? I don't know. I'm not a chemist. Someone can correct me there. So if the Timbor is allowed to air dry, will it cause damage to the tools, which are wiped down with a hobo oil at the end of each workday? If not, what should be done to protect the tools besides not using Timbor? So first thing you have to think about, and actually Matt Cremona brought this up on a recent episode of Wood Talk. I don't even know if that's been published yet. I can't remember. We record them all at the same time. But borates are, from an insect prevention, they are dependent upon ingestion. So you either sprinkle borate powder, or you put it in solution and you wash the board with it, and it relies upon the boring insects, ants, whatever, to eat the wood that's saturated with the borate solution. They ingest it and they die. So if those bugs have laid eggs, that borate won't do anything to those eggs until the larvae hatch and then eat the wood. The problem is how long will that borate solution last? It is a water-soluble solution, so if that is a board that's placed outside, or it's getting, water moving over it, flushing it out, even humidity could help, if not wash away the solution, it could certainly dilute it by adding more water into the mix. So years from now, and in many instances, those eggs can go unhatched for a very, very long time. Sometimes just depending on the climate that you put it into, or maybe a finish that you put over top of it could slow that down. There's been instances of wood-boring insects hatching, decades later. So that's really where the fault in these borate solutions comes into play, is you're only getting the active insects that are actively eating. And you may not get the eggs when they hatch. Maybe you've built in a piece of furniture and it's in your house now at that point. Maybe even the finish that you put on it diluted that borate solution. It could be a problem. So I'm not saying don't use it. It's a great solution. Just beware, it is not a foolproof solution. The only really foolproof way to get rid of bugs is through kiln drying and taking up to temperature and holding it to 48 to 72 hours to kill all the bugs, to nuke all the eggs, all that. That's really the only foolproof way of doing it. But here's the other thing about borates. Borax specifically is used as flux when welding two metals together. It cleans the steel of any impurities and allows you to weld another steel, either the same or different type of steel, right over top of it. So it basically can also act as a water repellent or a rust prevention, especially in higher carbon steels, aka tool steels. So I would think that if there was any borate solution on the wood, that might actually do the same thing your jojoba oil is doing. I'm not saying don't wipe it down at the end of the day, because really when you're wiping the tool down, you're also removing dust, which is hydrophilic, so it's going to bring water in and cause things to rust. The one thing about borax is it can crystallize and release water under really high heat, and that can cause corrosion. But I think for the tooling you're talking about, you're not going to be creating that type of heat. If you are, you got to sharpen that tool, man, or slow down. Stop creating so much friction with your hand plane. So I really don't see it being a problem. In fact, it might even aid in your rust prevention. So short answer, no, it's not a problem after my really, really long answer. I just found that particularly interesting as I dug into it a little bit more, and I didn't realize that it could also be a rust inhibitor. So there we go. Somebody out there who is screaming at me saying, I'm a chemist and that's not right, I'd love to hear it. But from my research, that certainly seems to be right. Feels right. I like it. That's what I'm going with. Got a question from, who's this from? From Hugh. And he is, I have a question for you. Can you discuss acacia wood? He puts acacia in air quotes, with emphasis on that air quotes. When I say acacia, every once in a while, I see it in cutting boards at Target or similar home goods stores, and they're ridiculously cheap. It makes me wonder, is that wood really acacia? And how are they able to sell cutting boards so cheap? So, flashing a slab of acacia on the screen. Here's the thing, Hugh. Quote, is it really acacia? End quote. What the hell's acacia? If you were to Google acacia, you'll find, well, some people, Wikipedia says there are thousands of species of acacia. Wood Database says there's like 184 different species of acacia. Acacia is a genus of woods. In fact, I featured Australian blackwood, Acacia meloxinen, which I've got a board for those watching the video right in front of me. I've actually got quite a few of these boards in the shop. I've also featured koa, Acacia koa, both woods in the acacia genus. So if you're saying, why is it so cheap? Is it really acacia? Maybe you're thinking of koa. Koa being an acacia is quite expensive. Australian blackwood is expensive. It's cheaper than koa, but it's still expensive. There are hundreds and hundreds of acacias. In fact, let me go back over to my screen share here and let me show you. The Wood Database has this little section. They have a page on acacia, and at the bottom they show the different acacia species. So I've got two columns here, and see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So he lists 30 different species that roll up under air quotes acacia, from pink gidgee to silver wattle to green wattle to ironwood, yarn, koa, lightwood, kurakuba, magnium. I like that one. I should get some magnium. Black wattle, Australian blackwood, meal, waddy wood, golden wattle. If you can't tell, acacia also goes by the name wattle. But yeah, acacia is a genus of things. It's found primarily in Australia, but it's also all over Southeast Asia. And it's been transplanted in Indonesia and Java and Sumatra and India, even Nepal, Vietnam, Thailand, etc. All those big lumber producing industries in Southeast Asia are producing, air quotes, acacia. So why is it so cheap? Well, because it's hundreds of different species, and you can cut down hundreds of different species that don't have any kind of grading rules behind them. It'd be impossible to come up with a grading rule for acacia. So you can sell it really cheap. You can find uses, especially for cutting boards. Cutting boards, think about when you build a cutting board. You go to your scrap bin probably, and you grab a bunch of just offcuts and you make a cutting board from it. How do you think they build cutting boards in an industrial sense? They ship containers full of scrap wood, pennies per board foot, fractions of a penny per board foot. And that's what they're making these cutting boards out of. But you also see entire furniture trades using acacia wood or rubber wood that shows up. These are furniture in general doesn't require large pieces. So you can cut around a lot of defects. You can use any number of species to create that. A lot of times there's a dark stain that goes over top of it to kind of unify the maybe 3 different acacia species in that one chair or that one table. Also, this stuff is being produced in Southeast Asia where the trees are being felled, where the trees are being sawn into logs, and they're shipping it over here. They're also getting around a lot of import regulations for lumber by turning it into cutting boards and turning it into furniture before they ship it. So that's why it's so cheap. It's the mass production that's going on right where the trees are being felled, and the fact that there are really no markets competing for that wood. You can look at, Douglas Fir, since it's our featured species, and you can say, okay, the construction market's its own thing, but kind of the fine fir side of things, you could have people who want to make moldings out of it. So they want 15-foot boards. You want people making siding out of it. They're going to look for 16-foot boards because of stud spacing. Then you may have flooring guys that are looking for, shorter boards and clear one face. And there's a lot of competition for that same tree. Acacia, because there's so many different species, you could say koa has a lot of competition from the guitar makers, the luthiers. But all the wattlewoods that I just listed off there, they don't have a primary trade going after them. It's really that furniture trade, that cutting board trade, the Pier 1 imports trade, if you will. Is that company still around? I think they went out of business. Home goods, whatever, all of those companies. That's the primary trade, and you've got this plethora of species that all are acacia, and you're not lying to say it's acacia. It is acacia. Yeah, that's even less lying than saying it's mahogany. It actually is the acacia genus. So yeah, I think that's kind of awesome because you've got these primary, secondary, and tertiary woods. I can't even say primary. It's secondary, tertiary, quaternary species that all have a home, and they all get lumped together into these furniture factories and, kitchen good type factories and turn into acacia ware. So yeah, that's why it's so cheap. But yeah, it's not a species. It's a genus. Finally, I have a question from Chad. He says, I am a fine woodworking student, Red Rocks Community College. Great program on the Front Range of Colorado there. Let's see. 2 woods we're not allowed to have in our shop are Paduke and Cocobolo due to one of the instructors having a serious allergy. They've talked a bit about becoming sensitized to woods through some of the exotics, and then the allergy then spreading and generalizing to what are normally more benign species. I wonder if you had anything to say on the science behind this. And what other species to pay particular caution when working with. So the first thing I'll say, Chad, is go check out episode 128, wood toxicity. And I talk about the various types of allergies from sensitizers and a lot of the species that affect it. Cocobolo is a particularly virulent one where even getting dust on your arm, on your bare skin, can cause a rash. Sensitizers means that the more you're exposed to that wood, the more allergic you become. It's a cumulative thing. So somebody may say, yeah, people say Cocobolo is really bad or Western Red Cedar is really bad, but it doesn't bother me. Work with it long enough and it will bother you, and your symptoms will become more extreme and flare up quicker. The more that sensitizer does its work on you, that cumulative effect. So what is also happening is internally, you're becoming sensitive to these things. Cocobolo, Paduke are, like I said, pretty virulent. So they're going to sensitize you quickly, but what's really happening is inflammation and things like that in your nasal passages to your skin itself. And it's kind of breaking down your immune response. I don't even know if we call it immune response. Yeah, let's just go with that. It's breaking down that immune response. So you're kind of compromised. And then you pick up a piece of Douglas Fir and, it's never bothered you before, but suddenly it's really affecting you. So it's kind of like the highway to a wood dust allergy. And Paduke, Cocobolo, and a lot of the rosewoods you'll find will do this. Basically, the Dalbergia genus is going to cause this. So yeah, there is real merit to that. I'm really sorry to hear that. Obviously, this is somebody who maybe didn't even have that much time working with Cocobolo or Paduke. And I'm not saying don't work with those species, but that is definitely a respirator, probably not just like a mask, but one of those like clean air, like wood turners respirators, because that stuff can be really nasty. And you're right, it will lead to your beloved cherry suddenly giving you problems. Maybe. I don't know, cherry's pretty benign. But yeah, that wood dust allergy can develop to the point where you can't work any wood at all. And it can certainly be sped along the way with some of those really nasty species, like cocobolo. Cocobolo is the first one that comes to mind. So yeah, check out wood toxicity, episode 128, for a little bit more information on that. And, actually, Chad has one more thing. He says, I work with many immigrants and refugees through my day job. And I recently met a gentleman from West Africa who worked in the timber trade. He did a lot of coordinating buys from international buyers. I had discovered your podcast a few months prior and had listened to your earlier episodes about CITES, the timber trade in Africa, etc. So it was great being able to make an instant connection and talk a bit of shop with him while we worked on his resume. So see, the lumber update is not just for wood nerds and for putting people to sleep at cocktail parties. It can help form business connections. It can help you make a sale. So next time, Chad, you make a sale, next time you find that awkward business lunch became less awkward because you got to talk about the lumber trade, you're welcome. All right, folks, I think that probably will do it for me. I do want to say thank you for listening to the show. Thank you for all the Patreon supporters for supporting the show, throwing a little money my way to help me keep this show going. It's always appreciative, and you will be getting your Douglas Fir stickers very shortly in the mail. So with that, go buy some lumber. Go buy some Douglas Fir. Find some really nice, clear, vertical grain Douglas Fir. Or better yet, buy a slab of Douglas Fir like this, and you can saw it into clear and pattern grade in your own shop.